The smell of formaldehyde and blooming magnolias usually meant a dignified goodbye. But Lakita Turner found no peace as she stared at her father's lifeless body. The silence of the funeral parlor was shattered by the rhythmic, heavy thud of a bailiff's boots and the sound of a red foreclosure notice being slapped onto the mahogany desk. As she reached for her father's private ledger, a thick envelope slid from a hidden compartment, revealing maps of a drainage system stained with suspicious chemical residue and a list of names. All of them buried in the very room where she stood. Outside, the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise, and the low growl of an idling black sedan at the gate signaled she wasn't alone. When she pulled back the silk lining of a display casket, she didn't find lace. She found stacks of vacuum-sealed cash that didn't belong to her family. A heavy shadow fell across the doorway, and the familiar click of a gun's safety echoed through the hall. Lakita realized that in this town, the dead weren't the only ones buried with secrets, and someone was coming to make sure she became one of them before the storm broke. The bus door hissed open, releasing Lakita Turner into the sweltering embrace of a Mississippi afternoon. As her heels met the pavement, the asphalt felt less like a road and more like a trap, soft and yielding under the relentless sun. The air hit her with the weight of a wet wool blanket, thick with the scent of river silt and the cloying, waxy sweetness of blooming magnolias. To Lakita, those white petals looked like funeral masks pinned to the trees, indifferent and pale. The cicadas screamed from the brush, a monolithic wall of sound that vibrated inside her skull until it became a physical ache. She drew a palm across the back of her neck, gathering beads of sweat that felt like oil, and stared at the shimmering heat haze dancing over the road. It led toward the house she had promised herself she would never see again. A place where the shadows were measured in inches and the silence was kept in jars. The heavy oak door of Turner's legacy groaned on its hinges as Lakita pushed her way inside. Above her, the bell gave a sharp, cracked chime, a sound that hadn't changed since she was a girl, though it seemed thinner now. The foyer greeted her with a familiar, suffocating bouquet. Formaldehyde, fresh wood lacquer, and the stale, heavy residue of incense. Behind the reception desk, the assistant mortician didn't bother to lift his chin from the ledger. Instead, he simply extended a hand toward her. A cold, trembling appendage that felt like damp parchment. Lakita's eyes skipped past him to the framed photograph of Elijah sitting on the desk. A strip of black silk was draped diagonally across the glass, cutting through her father's stern, unyielding face. The assistant's voice was a dry rasp as he delivered the news. Elijah's heart had simply quit, right there in that high-backed chair, less than 24 hours ago. Lakita's fingers dug into the edge of the mahogany counter, her knuckles turning a ghostly white. She watched a single shaft of afternoon light pierce the gloom, illuminating the dust motes that swirled like tiny ghosts over Elijah's empty seat. She had barely settled onto the velvet sofa in the hall, her fingers twisting a damp handkerchief into a knot, when a series of sharp, rhythmic blows struck the glass of the front door. The sound made Lakita jump, her heart hammering against her ribs. A man in a suit of cheap, shiny polyester marched in without waiting for an invitation, his mud-caked boots leaving a trail of filth across the pristine carpet. He ignored Lakita's outstretched, protesting hands and tossed a heavy envelope onto the coffee table with a dry rustle. The seal was embossed with the authority of the county court. Lakita's eyes locked onto the bold, black header. Notice of final foreclosure and seizure of property. The blood seemed to drain from her fingertips, leaving them numb and icy. The bailiff clicked the cap of his pen with a sound like a gunshot, demanding her signature while Elijah's body still lay cold and unprepared in the back room of the bureau. Lakita spread the documents across the desk, the fine legal print swimming before her eyes until the words blurred into a gray haze. Hidden among the dense paragraphs of the lien, one name leapt out at her, written in a graceful, sweeping calligraphy. Samuel Kincaid. The name brought back memories of endless white cotton fields and the towering, predatory figure of a man who wore white linen suits like a second skin. According to the papers, Elijah had mortgaged the very bricks of Turner's legacy at an interest rate that bordered on theft. Now, Kincaid stood as the sole legal claimant to the building. Lakita traced the Kincaid family crest on the collateral form, feeling a slow, hot pulse of fury thrumming under her skin. The family business, a sanctuary built by 3 generations of Turners, had been reduced to a single line in Samuel Kincaid's ledger of debts. The telephone receiver felt heavy against her ear as she listened to the rhythmic, mocking drones of the bank's hold music. When the operator finally connected, Lakita recited her father's security codes and account numbers, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. A long, suffocating silence followed. The clerk's response was a splash of ice water. Every account associated with Turner's legacy had been frozen by order of the security department. Desperate, Lakita pulled up the online banking portal on the office computer, her fingers flying over the keys. The screen flashed a violent, taunting red, displaying an access error. Where Elijah's life savings and pension should have been, she saw only a row of zeros. Lakita slammed the receiver back onto its cradle, the crack of plastic echoing through the empty office like a final, definitive sentence of ruin. The peace of the bureau shattered when the front door flew open from a massive kick. 2 men in scuffed leather jackets barged into the foyer, their presence an immediate stain on the quiet room. Lakita bolted upright as one of them swept a vase of dried lilies off a side table, the ceramic shattering against the floor. The larger of the 2 loomed over her, his breath a foul mixture of cheap tobacco and stale whiskey. He slapped a stack of IOUs onto the desk, each one bearing Elijah's unmistakable, looping signature. Debts Lakita had never known existed. She watched his tattooed knuckles drum a restless, threatening beat on the wood. He didn't ask. He demanded the cash by sunset. Lakita backed toward the wall, her shoulder blades vibrating with a mix of primal terror and a white-hot rage that threatened to boil over. Lakita turned the key in the lock of Elijah's private study and threw the heavy iron bolt. The room was a tomb of shadows, smelling of old paper, cedar, and the ghost of tobacco ash. She dropped to her knees before the safe hidden behind the portrait of the bureau's founder, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The shelves groaned under the weight of heavy ledger books as she began to tear them down, piling them on the desk. She flipped through the yellowed pages, her eyes straining to decipher Elijah's sprawling, hurried script. When she clicked on the desk lamp, the circle of light revealed folders containing the names of townspeople long since buried and forgotten. Methodically, she began to cross-reference burial dates with cash receipts, plunging headlong into a paper labyrinth where the truth lay buried under layers of ink. Her breath hitched as she found a double column of figures penciled into the margins of the main grossboo. Lakita's eyes widened at the sight of amounts that had never seen the light of an official tax audit. She found receipts for high-end mahogany caskets paid for in cash, sums that were triple the actual market value. Next to the names of the local poor, whose funerals were officially recorded as charity cases, Elijah had scribbled the initials S.K. A knot tightened in Lakita's stomach, hard and cold. Turner's legacy hadn't just been a funeral home. It had been a conduit for rivers of dirty money. She realized with a sickening clarity that Elijah had used the sacred silence of the morgue to mask a criminal exchange of currency, turning their family heritage into a high-end laundry for the town's filth. Marcus burst into the office without a knock, his face slick with a film of frantic sweat. He threw a pen and a stack of documents embossed with the Kincaid Plantation logo onto the desk in front of her. His voice rose to a jagged scream, begging Lakita to just sign the papers and end the nightmare before it swallowed them both. She watched his knees knock together, his head swiveling toward the closed door as if he expected the walls to cave in. He claimed Samuel Kincaid was their only lifeline, the only man who could keep them out of a prison cell for Elijah's crimes. Lakita looked at her brother, her gaze catching on the glint of a new, expensive watch on his wrist. A piece of jewelry that had no business being on the arm of a man facing ruin. Marcus stepped closer, trying to force the pen into her clenched fingers. Lakita watched her brother's hands, noting how they worried the hem of his jacket, never finding a moment of rest. He wouldn't meet her eyes, his gaze darting to the corners of the room, as if the shadows were closing in. When she asked him about Elijah's final transaction, Marcus's speech fragmented into a stuttering mess of half-truths and contradictions. She saw him lick his parched lips, his pupils blowing wide at the mere mention of Kincaid's name. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Marcus wasn't just a victim of their father's legacy. He was a participant. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with a terrifying snap. The financial collapse of the Bureau wasn't a tragedy of errors. It was the result of Marcus's own betrayal, a calculated move to sell his father's soul for a seat at Kincaid's table. Lakita spread the bank statements and the secret ledger pages across the floor, connecting the dots with a red marker like a map of a crime scene. The dates of the largest cash infusions lined up perfectly with the days Samuel Kincaid had expanded his land holdings across the county. She saw it then. Elijah's reputation for dignity and discretion had been the perfect shield for Kincaid's money laundering. Every body that passed through Turner's legacy provided a reason for bags of cash to move past the police unnoticed. A bitter taste filled her mouth as she accepted the truth. Elijah wasn't a man caught in a trap. He was a key link in the chain. The image of her noble, hard-working father crumbled into ash, leaving behind only the cold reality of a man who traded in silence and sin. Lakita stood up, her shadow stretching long across the office floor. She gathered the Kincaid documents and crushed them in her fist until the paper groaned. Walking to the window, she looked down to see a black sedan idling at the gates of the Bureau, its tinted windows reflecting the dying light. Marcus tried to grab her arm, his voice a frantic whisper, but she shook him off. Through the glass, she could almost feel Kincaid's gaze watching the house, waiting for the final surrender. She stood there, the weight of the ruined documents in her hand, knowing that the battle for Turner's legacy had moved beyond debts and into the realm of survival. The air in the basement was a different world, smelling of damp concrete, lime, and the metallic tang of old pipes. Lakita heaved a heavy steel rack of empty urns aside, the metal screeching against the floor. Behind it, a small steel door was set into the foundation, its surface pitted with age. The dial was cold against her fingertips as she worked the combination, following the faint, rhythmic scratches her father had left near the numbers. The door swung open to reveal a thick envelope sealed with black wax. Inside were blueprints, blue-inked maps of the drainage systems beneath the Kincaid estate. Lakita traced Elijah's red-ink notations, which highlighted hidden bypass pipes leading directly into the town's main water supply. The truth vibrated through her fingers. Kincaid wasn't just farming cotton. He was poisoning the earth. Lakita moved to the embalming room, spreading yellowed medical files across the stainless steel prep table. She held a magnifying glass over Elijah's cramped, jagged handwriting, her heart racing. The files contained photos of plantation workers Elijah had prepared for burial. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, Lakita saw what the town had missed. Strange, angry purple blotches and deep, weeping ulcers on the men's arms and torsos. She read the chemical recipes for the heavy-duty cosmetics Elijah had mixed. Thick pastes designed specifically to hide third-degree chemical burns. Her eyes stung from the phantom scent of the reagents as the scale of the fraud became clear. Every death certificate Elijah had signed citing natural causes was a lie. A carefully crafted mask for systemic industrial murder. She ran a hand over the polished lid of a nearby casket, the wood feeling slick and oily. The realization settled in her gut like lead. The funeral home hadn't just hidden money. It had hidden bodies and poison. Kincaid had used the crematorium's furnace and the deep, consecrated earth of the cemetery to dispose of toxic drums and the remains of those who had seen too much. The numbers in the secret ledger weren't just bribes. They were rental fees for the silence of the grave. In the corner of the room, she saw stacks of industrial absorbent that Elijah had ordered by the ton. Turner's legacy was the final stop for Kincaid's environmental atrocities, a dumping ground masquerading as a house of God. Lakita pulled the curtain back just enough to see two black SUVs blocking the driveway. Men in tactical jackets and dark glasses climbed out, their movements practiced and synchronized. One of them adjusted a holster on his hip with a casual, terrifying ease. From the rear of the property, the sharp, metallic clack of a rifle bolt being cycled echoed through the humid air. Kincaid's mercenaries were moving into position, forming a perimeter that cut off the road and the path to the river. She saw one man lift a pair of binoculars, the lenses reflecting the gray sky as he scanned the upper windows of the bureau. The world was shrinking, the walls of her home turning into the bars of a cage that Kincaid intended to be her tomb. The smell of smoke woke her, a sharp, acrid prickling that clawed at her throat. Lakita scrambled out of bed, the floorboards already radiating a sickening heat against her bare soles. In the hallway, she saw the orange glow of a fire gorging itself on the archives. The sound was a roar of crackling timber and the rhythmic pops of windows shattering under the pressure. She pressed a wet towel to her face and lunged for the desk, grabbing a handful of Elijah's files as the heat singed the hair on her arms. A shower of sparks rained down as a ceiling joist gave way, a flaming barrier cutting her off from the safe. Coughing and blinded by the haze, she turned and sprinted for the service exit, the roar of the fire at her heels. Lakita gripped the garden hose, the water hissing as it hit the smoldering ruins of the equipment shed. As the steam cleared, a glint of silver caught her eye amidst the blackened debris. She reached into the ash and pulled out a heavy metal lighter, the surface hot enough to sting. Etched into the side were Marcus's initials. A wave of cold fury washed over her, drowning out the lingering fear. Marcus hadn't just betrayed their father's memory. He had tried to burn his sister alive to protect his own skin. She squeezed the lighter until the metal edges bit into her palm, then turned back toward the main house. She knew exactly where he would be, hiding in the shadows of the morning hall, waiting for the smoke to clear. She found him cowering near a marble pillar and shoved him hard, his back hitting the stone with a dull thud. Lakita held the scorched lighter inches from his face. Marcus collapsed, his knees hitting the floor as he buried his face in his hands. His sobs were wet, echoing through the high-vaulted room and mixing with the lingering scent of smoke. Between gasps, the truth poured out of him. Kincaid had been paying Elijah for special disposals for years, and Marcus had been the one carrying the envelopes. He tried to justify it, claiming he was protecting her, protecting the business. But Lakita only looked at him with a cold, hollow disgust. Every word he spoke was a fresh shard of glass, tearing away the last remnants of the family she thought she knew. Lakita grabbed the heavy desk phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed Sheriff Miller's direct line. She waited, the dial tone a steady hum, but her eyes drifted to the window overlooking the front gates. She froze. A patrol car with its lights flashing had pulled up alongside Kincaid's limousine. Instead of storming the grounds, Miller stepped out and shared a laugh with Samuel Kincaid, their hands meeting in a firm, friendly shake. She watched Kincaid pat the sheriff on the shoulder, sliding something small into the man's pocket. Lakita slowly lowered the receiver, the line clicking into a dead silence. The law in this county didn't wear a badge. It wore a price tag, and Kincaid owned the ledger. She clicked on the old television in the foyer, the screen flickering to life with Kincaid's face. He was giving an interview on the lawn of his estate, looking every bit the grieving patron of the town. With a voice full of rehearsed sorrow, he told the reporter that Lakita Turner, driven mad by her father's death, had begun desecrating the cemetery in a deluded search for hidden inheritance. The news anchor's voiceover called her actions a sacrilegious assault on the community's peace. The screen showed edited footage of the fire-damaged archives, framed to look like the work of a lunatic. Kincaid urged the town to protect their traditions from this disturbed outsider, and Lakita felt the weight of the town's collective gaze turning into a noose. The sound of a crowd began as a low thrum, growing into a roar of angry voices outside the bureau's walls. Lakita peered through the front door's sidelight to see a sea of familiar faces. Neighbors, churchgoers, people Elijah had buried with dignity, now twisted into masks of rage. Old Mrs. Green stood at the front, her fist shaking in the air as she screamed for the grave robber to get out. The first stone hit a second-story window, the stained glass of an angel's wing shattering into 1,000 pieces. They began to pelt the facade with rotten produce and clumps of mud, their shouts a rhythmic chant of hate. In the distance, Kincaid stood by his car, a small, satisfied smile playing on his lips as the town did his work for him. The lights in the hallway flickered once and then died, plunging the house into a thick, suffocating darkness. Lakita reached for the phone again, but there was no dial tone. The wires had been cut. Outside, the only light came from the rhythmic flash of the patrol car's beacons, a silent reminder that she was being watched but not protected. The silence inside the bureau became a physical weight, broken only by the skittering of rats in the crawl spaces. She struck a match and lit a single candle stub, her shadow dancing on the wall like a tattered ghost. Kincaid had blinded her, silenced her, and left her alone in a dark stone box with nothing but the secrets of the dead for company. She put her shoulder against the heavy oak dresser in the foyer, grunting with the effort as she slid it across the floor to block the main entrance. The wood groaned against the carpet. She moved to the service door, hammering the steel security bolts into their sockets with a heavy mallet. Each blow echoed through the empty house, a desperate rhythm of fortification. She was a mortician, skilled in the art of sealing things away, and as she barricaded the final exit, she realized she was preparing Turner's legacy for its own funeral. She sat in the dark, clutching the files to her chest, waiting for the storm she knew was coming. Lakita stood by the window, watching the sky turn a bruised purple as the first heavy drops of rain began to smear the glass. When a crack of thunder shook the floorboards, she didn't hesitate. She sprinted for the rear garage, her boots echoing on the concrete. She threw herself into the driver's seat of the old service van, the smell of mildew and stale air filling her lungs. Her ribs ached where she pressed the leather satchel containing Kincaid's drainage maps against her side. The engine groaned, coughing twice before catching with a ragged roar. She gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, as the downpour turned the world outside into a blurred, gray wasteland of water and shadow. She slammed the van into gear and floored it, the tires screaming as they churned through the rising mud. The front bumper struck the iron gates with a deafening, metallic shriek, tearing the hinges clean out of the brickwork. In the rearview mirror, she saw the twin orbs of a black SUV's headlights flare to life, leaping into pursuit. The heavy steel ram of the mercenary vehicle slammed into her rear fender, the impact throwing her sideways against the door. Glass from the passenger window exploded inward, stinging her cheek like a swarm of hornets. Lakita fought the wheel, her muscles straining to keep the van on the narrow road as the SUV lunged again, the sound of grinding metal drowning out the rain. The van hit a patch of standing water and began to spin, the world outside the windshield a dizzying whirl of gray and green. Lakita felt the sickening lurch of the front tire dropping into nothingness. For a heartbeat, she was weightless. And then the world stopped with a bone-jarring crash. The van settled into the bottom of a steep drainage ditch, and the cold Mississippi rain immediately began to pour through the floorboards. She tasted salt and copper, blood from a split lip, and heard the frantic hiss of the radiator dying. The water rose quickly, soaking her jeans and numbing her legs, while the rhythmic drumming of the storm on the roof turned her vehicle into a hollow metal trap. She slammed her elbow into the spider-webbed windshield, kicking the glass out until there was a hole large enough to crawl through. Lakita tumbled into the waist-deep muck of the ditch, a sharp, white-hot pain shooting through her ankle as she landed. Limping, she scrambled up the embankment, heading for the jagged silhouettes of the cypress trees that marked the edge of the old cemetery. Behind her, she heard the distinct, mechanical clack-clack of weapons being readied. A bullet hissed past her ear, striking a granite headstone and spraying her with a shower of stone dust and sparks. She didn't look back. She just ran, her breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. The cemetery was a nightmare of tangled vines and slick, treacherous earth. Lakita tore through a wall of wild ivy that felt like skeletal fingers grasping at her clothes. The ground was a slurry of gray clay and rotting leaves, sending her sliding onto her knees every few steps. The rain was a cold curtain, stinging her eyes and washing the blood from her face as she wove between the rows of weeping angels and cracked marble slabs. She could hear the heavy, rhythmic splashing of boots behind her, closing the distance. The scent of the earth, churned up by the storm, was thick and suffocating. Ahead, there was nothing but an endless sea of gray markers, drowning in the rising flood. Her foot caught on the edge of a fresh grave, the earth giving way beneath her. Lakita plummeted into the dark, cold hole, her shoulder catching on a jagged piece of a fallen iron fence. The metal tore through her shirt and skin, a searing heat that made her vision swim. She clamped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream, the copper tang of her own blood filling her throat. Above, the beams of high-powered flashlights cut through the rain, sweeping over the cemetery like searchlights. She pressed herself into the mud at the bottom of the grave, watching the water cascade down the clay walls. A light lingered directly over her for a second, illuminating her trembling fingers before moving on. Lakita dragged herself out of the pit and stumbled toward the massive, salt-stained doors of the Turner family vault. The heavy chains that usually secured it had been sheared off, the granite threshold scarred with fresh gouges. She pushed the heavy door open, the hinges screaming in protest, and was met with the smell of old dust and expensive cologne. Inside, illuminated by a single flickering lantern, stood Samuel Kincaid. He leaned on his silver-topped cane, his shadow stretching across the marble niches that held the ashes of her ancestors. He turned his head slowly, his eyes reflecting the lantern light with a cold, predatory triumph that made her skin crawl. Two men shoved Marcus into the vault, his face a ruin of bruises and soot. He fell to his knees on the cold stone, a wet, hacking cough shaking his frame. Lakita moved toward him, but Kincaid's hand moved with a blur of speed, pulling a heavy black pistol from his coat. He pressed the muzzle against Marcus's temple, forcing the younger man's head to the side. Lakita watched Kincaid's thumb pull back the hammer, a small, mechanical sound that felt louder than the thunder outside. Marcus squeezed his eyes shut, his body trembling so violently that his teeth chattered. Kincaid's lips curled into a thin, bloodless smile as he held her brother's life in the balance. Kincaid's gaze dropped to the leather satchel Lakita was clutching against her chest. He held out his free hand, palm upward, in a silent demand. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, melodic purr that seemed to vibrate in the small stone room. He promised her a clean slate. The debts would vanish, the criminal charges would be buried by the morning, and they would both walk out of the cemetery alive. All he wanted were the maps. Lakita saw him press the barrel harder against Marcus's skin, a silent punctuation to his offer. She felt a bead of sweat roll down her spine, cold as the rain, as she looked from the gun to the man holding it. She looked at Marcus, and for a moment, the brother she knew was gone. He was a mask of terror and shame, his lips moving in a silent, pathetic plea for her to give in. He looked like a beaten dog, cowering at Kincaid's feet, his spirit completely broken by the weight of his own choices. Lakita saw the animal fear in his eyes, a raw, naked desperation that made her own heart ache with a mixture of pity and rage. He was willing to crawl through any filth to see another sunrise. Kincaid gave a short, satisfied nod, recognizing the moment Marcus broke, and Lakita felt her own grip on the satchel begin to fail. Lakita took a slow, deliberate step toward Kincaid, her arm extending the bag toward his waiting hand. As she moved, she caught a glimpse of the mercenaries behind Marcus. They were shifting their weight, their hands moving toward their knives and holsters. She saw the look Kincaid gave them, a sharp, almost imperceptible tilt of the chin. It was a signal she knew well from her work. The look of a man disposing of something that had outlived its usefulness. Kincaid had no intention of letting them leave the vault. Her fingers brushed the leather of the bag as Kincaid reached for it, the air in the tomb suddenly too thick to breathe, the silence pregnant with a coming gunshot. Lakita's fingers didn't release the strap. Instead, they tightened. With a sudden, violent wrench, she jerked the bag back toward her chest. The movement caught Kincaid off guard, his cane slipping on the wet floor. At that same instant, Marcus seemed to find a final, desperate spark of the Turner blood. He lunged upward from his knees, his hands locking around Kincaid's wrist like iron manacles. Lakita heard the wet snap of a joint, and Kincaid's grunt of pain as the pistol was forced upward, the muzzle tracing a wild arc in the air. Marcus threw his entire weight against the older man, pinning him against the marble shelves. Kincaid snarled, his free hand clawing at Marcus's throat, his face turning a dark, mottled purple. The two men thrashed in the narrow space, kicking up clouds of ancient dust that choked the air, their struggle a frantic ballet of survival and hate. Lakita didn't waste the heartbeat. She dived for her open embalming kit, her fingers frantic as they searched the velvet-lined compartments. They closed around the cold, fluted glass of a concentrated formaldehyde bottle. The red warning label, a splash of color in the gloom. She ripped the stopper out with her teeth, the pungent, suffocating fumes hitting her like a physical blow. As the first mercenary lunged toward her, his hand reaching for his sidearm, Lakita swung the bottle in a wide, desperate spray. The clear liquid caught the man directly in his wide, staring eyes. He let out a high, thin shriek of agony, his hands flying to his face as he collapsed, his rifle clattering uselessly against the stone floor. She didn't wait to see if he got up. She grabbed Marcus by the collar and pulled him toward the heavy stone door, the shadows of the vault finally closing behind them as they vanished into the rain.